All right, we'll go ahead and get started with the next session. Um, our speaker has already been introduced, but now he's wearing a different hat. Although, if he does, it's Robert Sikes. And if he does a visit for ALAC, is it a Sikes visit? Good question. Anyway. Bad, I'm laughing at my joke. Okay, so he's taking his tie off, so he's doing his biology professor kind of talk now, and covering your bases in animal acquisition, avoiding fees for legal defense. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Robert Sikes.
Thanks. And yes, my tie is off. So, dirty boots field biologist now. Okay, a little bit of background. I have served on IACUC as a committee member. I've chaired the IACUC, and now I'm facility director at my place. I have written a heck of a lot of protocols for the research that I do. So I'm walking in the shoes of both the investigator, or I've walked in the shoes of the investigator, as I do now, but also on the IACUC side. All right. I want to talk about animal acquisition. How do you get the animals? In a laboratory environment, it's real easy. Your protocol is approved, you order the animals, and they come in like this. Right? How does this work with wildlife? Let's say you need 24 bobcats, 24 alligators, all 3 to 4 feet long, and I don't know, throw in some bog lemmings for the various researchers. Can you order these? Can you purchase these wild animals and have them delivered? It turns out that, yes, you actually can. It may or may not meet your expectations. In browsing the internet for some evidence on animal acquisition, I came up with some interesting headlines. Okay, so this, when I was putting these slides together, this is July 15. Granted, this is in the Philippines, but if you need Burmese pythons, monitor lizards, leopard geckos, sugar gliders, these individuals used to be a go-to source for these. What about in the U.S.? This doesn't happen in the U.S., right? Okay, Virginia. Now, they did not specify what animals here, but they made it clear that, yeah, people were buying and selling wildlife and wildlife parts. I confess I've never seen this show. I don't watch TV, but the swamp people, this is real stuff. So what do you call a person engaged in commercial selling of wildlife? Felon. It's a great apprenticeship if you want a career stamping license plates or something like that. Probably not the situation you want to put your institution in, and certainly not the institution you want to be in as an investigator. So, how do you go about acquiring the animals you want to work with? This is what animal acquisition looks like if your target animal is beaver. What kind of non-target species do you think you might have to worry about here? Muskrat? Well, they're probably going to swim through the trap. Otter, certainly. How about alligators? That was my concern when I was wading out here. And that is me. Yeah, I was really concerned about the alligators. So both as an animal that I could potentially capture as a non-target species and one that could capture me as a target species. So this is what animal acquisition looks like if you're working with beaver. This is what animal acquisition looks like if you're working with black bear. And this is the way it works. Let's say you're changing a collar on the bear in the middle of the winter. By the way, bears do not hibernate. They do go into a winter lethargy, but yes, they will be aroused. This is what animal acquisition looks like if your target animal is moose. Take home. You're not going to order these animals. The investigator is responsible almost in every case for going out and acquiring their animals. So what do we as IACUC members, what do we as investigators need to deal with when we're faced with these sorts of decisions? The comment has come up already repeatedly, permits. So I grabbed a single page out of the wildlife model protocol template that the Mammal Society and the Ornithological Council put together some years ago. Now, both the ASM and the OC have modified this in previous years, so the versions now differ a little bit, but this page hasn't changed. This is one portion of one page out of that protocol. And this one deals exclusively with permits and exclusively at the federal level, or well, almost exclusively at the federal level. Because it's stating U.S. Migratory Bird Treaty Act, Endangered Species Act, CITES, etc. This is just for going out and capturing the animals. So the take home for you as investigators, as IACUC members, as institutional officials, you better make darn sure this is one checkbox that is absolutely checked before you turn loose the investigator to go with this. These permits are really important. And Randy stated this earlier, and I'm going to come back and hammer on it. This also came up in questions. The permits, who are you getting them from? Typically, certainly at the state level, you're getting them from the organization, the agency that's charged with protecting that natural resource. So by getting those permits, your IACUC is assured to at least some extent that the potential impact on the broader environment, the habitat, the populations, the community, is evaluated to at least some extent, because that is what these agencies are charged with. So this is not just another hoop that the IACUC or that the investigator has to jump through. It also tags an important one of those 9 R's that Randy was talking about. This is an additional assurance that the impact on the wild populations, on the community, is either negligible or it's justified, because these are the agencies charged with exactly that responsibility. They are not charged necessarily with evaluating the humaneness of the techniques and what have you. That's for your IACUC. But your IACUC does not have the resources to make these sorts of calls. To know what the impact is going to be or likely to be on the population, you've got to know something about densities. You've got to know something about the food level at that time of year. Judging from the mass crop around my house right now, the mouse population in the spring is going to be astronomical. So I should be able to go out and trap any species with no problem. I'm going to remind the game and fish of that when I send my permits through next year. Should be no impact on the environment or on the populations. All right, so check off the permits. Make sure that you've got these in place, and then keep them. Make darn sure these permits stay with the investigator. Make sure that your permits, whatever the investigator is going to do, is covered by that permit. I was collecting animals by spotlighting and shooting them many years ago, like 30 years ago. And that point was driven home because I had neglected to inform the local wildlife officers that we were going to be out shooting animals. And they came up behind us with blue lights flashing. Okay, we actually were covered, but they reminded me, or actually they reminded my professor at the time, I was a student, that yes, your permit covers this, but we need to know that you're out doing this. So that now is written in as part of the permits. Notice at the bottom, there's a statement in bold that is included in this page in our model protocol, and it's actually included several times in that model protocol. If your research requires federal or state permits, it is unlawful to begin work until all permits have been obtained. You may not start the work for which permits are required until the permits are issued, even if your protocol has been approved. So when the investigator gets their approved protocol back and it's signed, this is a statement, an additional statement to them that, yes, your protocol is approved, but for that protocol to be valid, you've got to have all of the permits. This is an important part of closing the loop to make sure that you as an ICUC or as an investigator, you're doing your due diligence. Here's a really valuable resource. This one is a table, a portion of a table out of an article that Ellen Paul was the driving force behind putting this table together, so she gets full credit for this. This is in a paper published in 2013. This is a hot link. Again, you've got all of these slides, so you can pull this up. This table lists just the federal permits, not at the state level. You've got to get down to state level. Beyond state level, even within the state, you better check on local or federal requirements within the state. If you're working in a National Park Service, Tracy Thompson is going to be really upset if you start work without their ICUC having approved that protocol. And a lot of times, it's going to be a complimentary review. So it's going through perhaps at the same time as your ICUC is reviewing it, or they will review what was approved by your ICUC, but they still have to sign off on it. If it's a state park, the state park system may have additional permit requirements. And there's one where it's not an official permit, but if you're working on private land, it's a good idea to have authorization from the landowner. What about beyond state, federal? What about international level? If you have investigators, and most of you probably do, working in other countries, what are the requirements in that country to collect the animals? And then, if any of those specimens are coming back in any form whatsoever, what sort of requirements are required to get them out of the country of origin into the United States? This is where lack of due diligence can really bite hard. I know of an institution very recently, they got tagged for bringing in animals, and honestly, they thought they were checking all the boxes. But it turns out that there was a change in how some of those specimens were classified in terms of what was required for transport of those specimens. That can result in a really whopping big fine. In that particular case, the fine was reversed upon appeal, but it took close to a year to get that decision squared away. If you're collecting in one state and bringing it across to your institution in another state, what permits are required for the states in between? Or are permits required for the states in between if you're transporting exotics through their state? What are the potential hazards in terms of pathogens that could be released in that state if, in fact, those animals got loose? Who handles the paperwork? These permits are an absolute requirement, but who handles the paperwork? Is it the PI? Is it the ICUC? Really, however you set this up is really up to the institution, and different institutions will come at this different ways. Some institutions will set it up so that the ICUC is receiving copies of all permits before they're going to approve a protocol. In other institutions, they'll handle the protocol and simply state to the PI in writing that before you can exercise the activities that are approved in this protocol, it's your responsibility to get all of the protocols. However the institution sets that up really is up to you. And I think all of the regulatory agencies and OLA, the funding agencies, are comfortable with with your institution having the latitude to set up a system that works for you. And Axel can correct me if I'm wrong, or Nicolette. As long as you have a system in place that assures that these responsibilities are in fact met. So there's some pluses and minuses to each way. So I want to hammer on those just a little bit. In terms of the advantages to the ICUC handling the paperwork, they know in advance, before they approve the protocol, that yes, they have the correct authorizations. They know how many animals have been approved at the state or federal level. They know what collection methods have been approved at the state or federal level, assuming that the state protocol or federal protocol specifies that. They know whatever restrictions. That's an assurance for the institution that basically they're protecting themselves. You're protecting the institution. The institution is not the one that goes to jail. The investigator is. So the other approach is to put the monkey on the back of the investigator because they are the go-to-jail person. They're the ones responsible for closing all of those loops, making sure that they have all required protocols and that they're following those protocols. Either way works. It depends on what your risk aversion is at your institution. And I know institutions that do it both ways. My institution, they will ask for a protocol number if one is available, but then our protocols expire every year. It's my responsibility as the investigator to make sure that I keep that protocol current. And I don't even necessarily send them a copy of my updated protocol. Some institutions will require that you send that updated protocol. So what's the advantage of putting the onus on the investigator versus the ICUC? One difference is that the expiration dates of the permits are almost never the same as the expiration dates of the protocol. So really, you're imposing a pretty substantial regulatory burden on the PI to generate an additional report at the expiration of their protocol if it doesn't coincide with what the state or federal agency requires. The flip side of that is you're trusting that PI to make sure that your institution stays out of trouble. So again, either way works. Just make sure you have a system and you follow that system. While we're on this paperwork, what about animals, specimens that are collected and deposited in systematics collections or tissue collections? You better darn well make sure that the permits stays with those specimens. There have been instances where regulatory agencies have come into systematics collections and asked to see permits that approve the collection of various species. And there have been instances where those permits were not available, particularly for animals that are brought in from outside the country. So by default, most systematics collections will require copies of permits for specimens that are deposited in their collections. That becomes part of the curatorial record. So maintaining that database is really, really critical. Let me hammer on systematics collections just for a moment. Randy also brought this up, that this is a way to maximize use of those animals. The American Society of Mammalogists went so far as to, when we revised our guidelines in 2016, we specified and strongly urged investigators working with animals to deposit their specimens, any animals that were killed or euthanized as part of the study, in some sort of a systematics collection. But you need to make arrangements with the systematics collection beforehand. You can't just drop them off crates of carcasses and say, here you go. And part of the reason behind that is the paperwork has to go with those animals. I'm putting this up again. You've got to close this loop. This is stated in that model protocol, both on the Ornithological Council side and the mammal side, several different places. Nice big bold letters set out from everything else. Make sure that you close this loop. This is one of the most critical in terms of covering your bases. All right. I've got one last slide to leave you with, and it is resources. And I've tried to kind of rush through this and actually omitted some other parts because as we went through the last session, we learned, or at least I learned, that the question and answer system, the question and answer session was perhaps as valuable as the presentation itself. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and answers on this. The last slide really is nothing more than resources. Each of these resources that is highlighted here has some statement or some information about permits. But more importantly, these are much broader resources. One of the things that I want every person to leave this conference with is a list of resources, the printed resources, the online resources, but more importantly, the human connections that you make here. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I will invite any of you that need to contact me. My contact information is throughout this presentation at any time. I'm going to stop and open this up for questions now, specifically on permits. And I'll put my contact information back
up. Two questions real quick. On the permits, a lot of wildlife protocols we get in, the PI faculty member already has their permits in place for various collections, but they're working with grad students whose permits are pending because sometimes it can be a lengthy process. And on some of those, the grad student is actually going out and doing the collections without the PI present. Is that a violation if their permit is pending?
You know, that's really going to depend on how your state or agency deals with that. In Arkansas, for example, I mean, I can speak about the state I know. The students do not get a collecting permit if they're doing this as part of a class project. If they're doing it as part of a research project and they are the PI, then yeah, they'll have to apply for their own collecting permit. But if it's part of a class project, and I do have my mammalogy students, for example, I require a collection. They work under my permit, but they have a signed copy that's personally signed by me, not a photocopy, in their possession. So making sure that they have that paperwork with them when they're collecting those animals is important.
This is specifically relating to graduate students that are working on PhD projects that they're not part of a class. This is actually part of their PhD program, their graduate program, and they have a faculty advisor, and they will be doing this basically not as part of a class, but part of their program. And I just didn't know if that's an area that's come up in the past, because when the protocol is submitted, the PI we don't have graduate student PIs. They have to have a faculty advisor. We do not. It's just a policy we've had. It works out real well because then there's one PI to answer all the questions for his grad students.
Actually, that's a great question, and I can't answer that definitively because it's probably going to vary by state. If your state if your PI, their faculty advisor, has got a permit that covers those animals and that activity, then they may in fact be able to work under that for some period of time. If those animals or that activity is not included under the faculty member's permit, then they're probably not covered.
And the other question, okay, and then the other question was just on the collections. We have a mammals collection at OSU, and that's where if we have any inadvertent trapping casualties, that's normally where they'll wind up. Residual euthanized species or animals that are brought back, utilized, they go into the collections. So all those need a copy of the PI's collecting permit, and it clearly states in the protocol. We always make sure that it is that any animals that are euthanized or die unexpectedly will be incorporated into our museum, as we call it, our systematics. So that should have a file. That museum should have a file for all animals that are admitted to it, that are donated to it from field collections during research projects.
My recommendation is yes, that would be best practices. Where it's going to matter is if an agency, federal or state, comes up and asks you to prove that those animals were collected legally, you've got to have some sort of documentation to back it up. So you could rely on the state agency, say, hey, I need a copy of my permit from 10 years ago. I'm not going to trust that. I'm going to have a copy of it there. And I'll give you another example where this can matter. We have sometimes gray bats, Myotis grisescens, given to us that have died for whatever reason. That's a federally endangered species. When those bats come to us, they come to us through the state agency or perhaps a federal agency, and they come with a letter that they are donating that carcass to our museum, and it better be there when you're talking about a federally endangered species. Okay. Well, actually, roadkill in my state, my permit covers me picking up roadkill. So yes, it depends. Again, that's a state-specific thing. Just cover your bases. Make sure that you don't go to jail over it.
Yeah, hi. Should the IACUC ask that the permit specifically address final disposition of the animal, especially if it's planned euthanasia, or does the permit just authorize capture and then it's up to the IACUC to approve whatever happens after that?
You know, that's really a great question, and I don't know how variable this is across states. I know that my state's permit asks specifically how I will be killing animals. And my permit, honestly, my state collecting permit allows me to collect everything that is a reptile, amphibian, fish, or mammal in the state boundaries except for threatened, endangered, or species of special concern. And it also lists, you know, half a dozen or 10 methods of killing. So, so the methods of euthanasia are covered. Final disposition of the animals, when I'm collecting them, it states that they're going to a systematics collection, that they're going to be deposited at the ULR systematics collection.
So let me address this as well. I'm Chris Parkinson. I do the reptile amphibians. I have state permits for about 15 states across the country to collect, and almost every one of them states in my state permit what museum I should be depositing my specimens at. And so that's basically in the state permit for me to collect. And then I do international work as well. And a lot of times those international permits have in the collecting permit specific collections that those animals would go to. So my IACUCs that I've dealt with over the past, you know, I've shown copies of my permits post to them for the disposition of those specimens.
In the back?
You mentioned earlier that many state agencies, and I know USFS, U.S. Forest Service, was working on getting their own IACUC and that sort of thing. You mentioned earlier that some of these agencies are getting their own IACUCs and want to do reviews. How is that triggered? Is that triggered by the obtaining of a permit, requesting a permit? What triggers that? Why is it needed? And could you give us an example of some of the agencies that are requiring this now?
I'll give you an overview, at least from what I know of the National Park Service, and then I'll ask Tracy to chime in if I miss anything. It is my understanding that the Park Service requires a copy of the state IACUC protocol, and they will review that. If they feel that it is sufficient, they may simply grant approval as it's written. If they feel that that protocol doesn't ask maybe some of the questions that the IACUC would need to do a conscientious job at reviewing that, then they reserve the right to have you answer additional questions or to submit their protocol. So it really depends on how your protocol is written. Now, to follow up on that, when the protocol involves wildlife research, if you have a protocol form that is tailored specifically for wildlife and for field studies, it's going to answer, or it's going to ask those questions. So a key point here is tailoring your protocol form to ask the questions that get at the substance of what's important for a wildlife review. After all, the protocol is the tool that IACUCs use to elicit the information we need for an appropriate review, right? Tracy, you want to follow up on that?
Thanks, Bob. I'm Tracy Thompson with National Park Service. I'm the IACUC chair and attending veterinarian there. And we do get triggered by the park permitting system. So if you're going to do work in a National Park Service unit, there is a scientific permit process that you need to go through in order to get permission to work in the park. And that is actually now, there's wording there for you as a researcher when you're applying for that permit to contact our IACUC. There should be a link eventually when they do their online updates with OMB approval coming hopefully this year for those changes. But typically the parks either contact our IACUC office directly to let us know that there's a project coming through that looks like it probably needs IACUC review. Or there's a link, as I said, that's on that permitting process that should trigger you to come to us. What we're looking for is any vertebrate animal wildlife work that's going on in National Park Service units. If you already have IACUC approval, and I'll address this in one of the sessions later on in this conference, but we do a concurrence review, as Bob suggested. So that we're going to want to see your approved protocol from your home institution, whether it's a state agency or another federal agency or an academic institution, wherever you're working with that you already have IACUC approval. We want to see that it's been approved, and we'll do a concurrence review. To be fair, we often do see a lot of gaps between what our requirements are in order to know whether or not what you're doing is compliant with the Animal Welfare Act. We would want to talk with you if we need to get something changed and maybe an amendment for your protocol to your home institution. And I'm going to pass to Patty for hers.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's get Patty's input on this.
Hi, so I'm Pat Klein from Forest Service, and similarly, I'll just echo Tracy's comments. We too required to have a permit to come onto national forest lands. So you have to have that sort of entry permit to go and do any work on the National Forest Service lands. Plus, as well, for the IACUC, we will look at if there's another institution that wants to do research. We will also do a concurrence. We want to make sure that, again, they're following, our institution's IACUC procedures and practices as well as their own. So there's that kind of marriage then between the two IACUCs to make sure that we're all on the same page. And I think that would probably be the best I can say for the time. So yes, Forest Service, the same thing on the federal side.
Randy?
Bob,
Randy?
playing devil's advocate, if I'm an IACUC chair, I would contend that all permits and all ancillary IACUC reviews would need to be in place before my IACUC at my institution would ever approve your protocol. The reason being that if the institutional IACUC has the ultimate responsibility for ensuring that science and welfare are taken care of, I don't know that any of these other places are actually going to approve the study until such time as they do. So I'm going to submit that the IACUC at the institution should have the last say. How do you respond to that?
Well, that's a great approach. However, what do you do with those agencies that will not provide a permit until they see an approved protocol?
Well, then they're just going to have to change because the local IACUC trumps the federal agency, doesn't it?
Well, there's someone going to have to
Who's
change
going
there.
to jail? The IO at the institution's going to jail. So why should the IO wait for these other agencies? How was that for being provocative?
Actually,
Yeah.
a lot of times it is the investigator that goes to jail rather than the IO when it comes to permitting issues.
That's not what they told me.
That's just because you were the IO.
I know.
Yeah, the IO is just a fly in the ointment.
Absolutely.
I have some questions mainly about permits from out of country, and this is getting back to his point. Many of our PPIs are going into a country that they can't get the permit until they're in the country. So we have to depend on them to send us the permit after they come back. And I was trying to get some feel from that from the group, if that's the common thing. We have to kind of go on goodwill and trust, and it's worked so far. But again, we tell them that they can't start their work until the protocol is in place. So is that common? I mean, is that the way it works overseas?
The countries that I've had interaction with, primarily South American, yes, the PI is responsible for getting those permits.
Yeah, so that's pretty much it. I've worked all over, in Mexico this year for the first time in 20 years. We actually got our permit before because of our Mexican collaborators. They were able to get everything. But Honduras this year, until we got in country and spent 2 weeks in country before we were able to get the permit to actually go in the field. And I've also spent time in country and not got the permit and had a very good vacation and then came home. But so that's how the IACUCs I've been associated with, because you don't have it, because most of the time, unless you're the person walking from office to office to office in country and with local collaborators, it's not going to happen.
So Randy's suggestion would have been kind of a problem there, wouldn't it, Chris? Yeah, what can you say?
What would you suggest an IACUC should do in a case where a PI proposes to acquire animals from a resource, sort of like the ones you showed earlier, captive breeders of exotic animals? Does the IACUC have to request that the PI provide the permit of that captive breeder, that seller?
It's the institution. The institution bears some responsibility here. So the institution needs to have at least due diligence. Would I encourage any institution to allow purchase like that? You better back trail that breeder. And for some animals, this is way more problematic than others. With a lot of fish and a lot of reptiles, you actually can acquire them, maybe not ultimately legally.
Right.
Chris, did you want to follow up on that? I know captive reptile breeders are a really big deal. This is the level of interaction that we want out of these 3 days.
So
yes.
for reptiles and amphibians, and you see a lot, there's a lot of importation of reptiles and amphibians. There's a huge quote unquote herp community that breeds a lot of reptiles and amphibians out there. And they do it completely legally, and they import legally. And so there are companies set up that do this with a variety of species. And, I've interacted with quite a few of them, and the very good ones will show and document the legal aspects of importation of those animals.
Back trail your suppliers.
All right. I can just offer a couple points of clarification. I'm here from NOAA Fisheries in the Permits and Conservation Division, so I can't speak to other federal agencies or state agencies, but for our marine mammal research permits, the way we do it is we require a copy of your IACUC protocols, and they must match what's reflected in your permit application. And then we condition your permit that your permit is not effective until you've received and sent us your IACUC approval. So it's kind of a two-step process. And the other thing I would add is, echoing Dr. Sikes, is that for permanent collections and disposition of samples, your permit specifies where the parts can go, and you can always request an amendment to that. However, our record schedule is such that we destroy records 10 years after expiration, but you are still required to have a copy of that permit that lives with the sample as long as it exists. So we may actually destroy record of that permit, but you, as the holder of the sample, are required to keep it.
Folks, just a little tiny follow-up on the archival aspect of systematics collections. It's not just the permits that go into those collections. It's typically the investigators' field notes, notebooks that go with that. You don't know how those data may be used in the future. So that's part of an archival system.
Like Randy, in fact, he has more field study experience than I do, but the discussion just now triggered in my mind one of my real concerns about the whole ICO process. And you'll hear me say this later on today, but it can easily devolve into crossing T's and dotting I's. So it seems to me the question about should an institution allow something to happen if, I think part of that discussion needs to be what's in the best interest of the animals that are being considered there. You know, is the acquisition of those animals really in their best interest? So we need to remember that that's part of the process as well. It's not just making sure that all the paperwork is taken care of.
Yeah, if I could echo that, actually. An example that comes to mind is when I emailed Tracy about something that one of our students was going to do in Rocky Mountain National Park. And I said, well, their IACUC is the best equipped, but who's getting the money? So that's something to consider. As we're talking about collaboration, you should talk to sponsored programs. I know that talking about money is never really a fun thing, but I had to find out who is the primary. And then if I don't have a primary at my institution, we're getting a sub, then it is very much in their purview and I get an MOU with them. So that is what our process would be if someone said to me, I'm gonna do something in the park. And I said, great, talk to Tracy, but who's getting the money? Because then that reduces the administrative burden.
Just a quick note on sort of the state perspective that in many instances now with national parks having IACUCs, Forest Service having IACUCs, the state may have an IACUC, so you may have to go through multiple hoops depending on what percentage of public land you might have, and then also on bringing other animals in for research into a captive situation is that many states have a prohibited species list. So you might be able to buy deer online for your research project, but they may be illegal to possess in the state that you're in. So just some of the things that you need to consider, that there's regulations at every turn, and I think as the researcher, it's your responsibility to figure out where those are.
I'd like to bring, we're out of time. I want to bring us back to one issue, and that is that, hey, this is about permits. Why do we have permits on this? You don't have permits when you're doing lab mouse stuff. Why do we have to have permits here? It comes back to what Randy was saying. These are, and what many people have said here, these are animals that you own. You, the public. So we have these permits because they are managed by agencies charged to protect those animals, those resources, those natural resources that you own. And that's a fundamental difference between wildlife research and biomedical research. We do have to have these permits, but they serve a very important purpose in terms of safeguarding the natural populations and the ecosystems. Thank you, folks.